So this lesson, y'all, is going to be exactly the same as the other lesson on how to write your subtopic sections. However, in this lesson, I'm going to walk you through the whole process. So by the end of the video, you'll actually have your first subtopic written. You have two goals when you're writing your subtopic sections. Number one, I need to see that you're elaborating on your subtopic. Really teach the reader about the topic and the science of the topic. Number two, you need to use a variety of types of evidence to develop your idea. So let's look at the organization of your subtopic section. Like with a body paragraph, your subtopic section is going to start with a topic sentence. What are you arguing in this section? The middle is going to be a blend of both elaboration and evidence. Your elaboration is your explanation in your own words. Really teach the reader about the science of the subtopic, explain what you learned in your research, those facts, and help the reader to understand your evidence. Evidence is anything that helps you prove your topic sentence. This might be examples, anecdotes, studies and statistics, or testimony, those expert quotes. You're going to wrap up this section with a concluding sentence. This is where you'll wrap up your ideas and you'll transition to the next topic. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to model each part of the subtopic section. Then I'm going to ask you to pause the video and to go write that section. So I'm going to start with my topic sentence. This is the 1 to 2 sentences where I'm going to outline for the reader what I'm arguing in this section. So here's my topic sentence. Climate change causes ocean waters to warm, which is a huge problem for coral reefs. Nothing is quite as harmful to coral reefs as warming water. So in this section, I am going to prove to you that warming water is harmful for coral reefs. I'm going to ask you to pause the video right now and to go and to write your topic sentence. So now we're going to move into elaboration. In our elaboration, we're going to explain a part of the topic or the science of the topic in our own words. We're going to explain what we learned in our research, those facts. This also might be a place where we can define some of those academic vocabulary words, those sciencey terms that we're using in our elaboration. So when you think about your two sections of elaboration, you might think about what does the reader need to know first to understand the problem. So I felt like when I looked at my elaboration that you as the reader really needed to understand how coral reefs developed and why they were dependent or why they really depended on those photosynthetic algae, the zooxanthellae, to really survive, because that's going to be important later on in understanding coral bleaching. So that's the first part of the science that I'm going to explain. So here's my elaboration. Coral reefs are created by tiny organisms called polyps. When a polyp attaches itself to a rock on the seafloor, it divides into thousands of little clones. Those clones connect to one another, over time creating the limestone skeleton of the coral reef. Although polyps are the backbone of the reef, zooxanthellae, photosynthetic algae that attach themselves to polyps, is what gives the coral reef its brilliant colors. So I want you to notice here that I'm really trying to slow down and explain all of the science of how a coral reef is created and why those photosynthetic algae, the zooxanthellae, are so important to the coral reef. I'm also defining two academic vocabulary terms here. I'm defining polyps for you. I'm also defining zooxanthellae. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video right now and to go and to write a part of your elaboration. This might be 2 to 3 short paragraphs. So let's build in some evidence here. I want you to look at your evidence, and I want you to choose a piece of your evidence that helps to support what you just talked about in your elaboration. So I was just talking about how the coral polyps really depended on the zooxanthellae, those photosynthetic algae, for food. So I'm going to choose a piece of evidence that proves that. According to Nick Graham, a marine ecologist at Lancaster University in England, corals depend on zooxanthellae. The algae provide the corals with energy and nutrients. Without them, the corals would die. So I chose a piece of evidence that helped me to really explain how the coral was dependent on the zooxanthellae, those photosynthetic algae. I want you to notice here that I'm not only telling you who the person was that said this, but I'm telling you why they're an expert. He's a marine ecologist at Lancaster University. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video right now and to go decide on a piece of evidence, whether that's testimony, a statistic, or an example that you can use that's going to support what you just said in your elaboration. So let's keep going. This is going to be my second section of elaboration. So in my first section, I told you why those photosynthetic algae, the zooxanthellae, were so important to the coral reefs, to the coral polyps. So now I'm going to tell you what happens when the water is warm, how the coral polyps are actually going to spit out those photosynthetic algae. So here's my elaboration. I'm going to explain another part of the topic or the science of the topic in my own words. I'm going to explain what I learned in my research. When ocean water is warm, even by a few degrees, the coral polyps spit out the zooxanthellae. This causes the reef to lose its color, turning white. This is the first and most visible sign of coral bleaching. Again, I'm really taking my time in explaining all of the parts of the science of coral bleaching. Although devastating for tourists to coral reefs, the loss of color is not why warming waters are coral's real enemy. When the coral polyps evict their colorful boarders, the zooxanthellae, they are cutting themselves off from their primary food source. They're starving themselves. Coral can bounce back from a bleaching event. However, heat waves are becoming more and more frequent due to climate change, which doesn't allow them the time to fully recover. So I'm moving in to talk about how even though coral may be able to come back to life after a bleaching event, because of climate change, they just can't get over it. They can't recover after all of the different heat waves. So now I'm going to move into evidence. So I'm going to go choose a second piece of evidence that's going to help me talk about what I just talked about in my elaboration. It's going to help me support that. So I actually have two here. You're welcome to just choose one, but here's my first one. It's another piece of testimony. Those that survived 1 year of bleaching, said Mark Aiken, coordinator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Coral Reef, are less likely to endure another event and are more vulnerable to disease like drought-weakened trees in the American Southeast that are now susceptible to bark beetle infestations. So I was just talking about in my elaboration how the coral can't bounce back after a bleaching event, how they're really having a hard time recovering. So I chose a piece of evidence from Mark Aiken, and I'm telling you why he's an expert. He's a coordinator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But I'm choosing a quote where Mark Aiken is going to tell us how corals can't bounce back after a heat wave because it makes them more susceptible to disease. It makes them more likely to get sick. So now I'm actually going to use another piece of evidence that is going to support this. I had a great example, so I want to use this here also. So I'm just going to throw this piece of evidence after this first one right here. For example, when scientists surveyed the damage of the 2016 heat wave that hit Australia's Great Barrier Reef, they found that over half of the reef had died due to either starvation or disease. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video now and to go write your elaboration, your second piece of elaboration, and your evidence. So let's finish it up. We're going to finish it up with a concluding sentence. In our concluding sentence, we're going to wrap up the ideas in the paragraph. We're going to remind the reader about our topic sentence. and then we're going to transition to our next subtopic. So here's my concluding sentence. Few reefs will survive the ever-warming oceans caused by climate change. So I'm reminding the reader what my topic sentence is, that they really can't survive the warming waters. Those that do survive will suffer the impacts of ocean acidification, another byproduct of our increased carbon emissions. So my next subtopic here is ocean acidification. So that's how I'm transitioning, is by saying those that do survive warming waters are definitely not going to survive ocean acidification. So you need to now pause the video and to go write your concluding sentence. So at this point, you should have your first full subtopic section written, and you then should be able to go write your second and your third. Get started.